35,000 years before Christ, in the limestone valleys of what would eventually require a proper name like France, winter arrived with the subtlety of an avalanche. One rather suspects that Usher, watching her youngest son develop that particular listlessness that preceded starvation, did not appreciate the aesthetic qualities of the season. The autumn herds had departed south with their usual discourteous timing, and she found herself performing the grim mathematics that passed for survival planning in the Upper Paleolithic. Half her clan would be dead by spring. This was not pessimism. This was accounting. The numbers, one must understand, were perfectly straightforward. A mammoth kill, assuming one's hunting party survived the attempt, which was far from guaranteed, fed everyone for approximately 3 days before the meat acquired that distinctive quality that modern humans associate with food poisoning and ancient humans associated with death. This necessitated constant hunting expeditions in weather that would have modern survival experts filing strongly worded complaints. Usher's mate led yet another party into what can only be described as a white void of enthusiastic hostility, while she searched for frozen roots, her fingers turning the sort of black that indicated her body had made some rather firm decisions about priorities. Her milk had dried up weeks earlier. Her body, operating on its own brutal logic, had decided that keeping her alive was more important than keeping her infant alive. Evolution can be remarkably unsentimental. The accident, because the greatest discoveries in human history have this annoying habit of being accidents, occurred during a blizzard that trapped the women and children in a secondary cave. One imagines they were not having the time of their lives. Usher stumbled over something beneath the snow, which is never an encouraging start to a story in the Ice Age. It was a chunk of reindeer meat from a kill made 2 moons prior, a period during which meat should have transformed into something that would enthusiastically kill anyone foolish enough to eat it. Instead, it remained red and fresh, as though time itself had forgotten about it. The sensible thing would have been to leave it alone. Usher, demonstrating either courage or the sort of desperation that closely resembles courage, tasted it carefully. She then waited for the cramping that signaled she had made a terrible mistake. The cramping did not arrive. The meat was, rather infuriatingly, sweeter than fresh-killed meat. One can almost hear her thinking, well, this is interesting. That night, while the wind demonstrated its impressive range of shrieking abilities, Usher conducted what might generously be called humanity's first controlled experiment and more accurately be called playing with death. She buried fresh rabbit meat at various depths in the snow. Some she wrapped in hide, some she left exposed. Each piece represented a hypothesis that could potentially kill her family if proven incorrect. Trial and error takes on rather more weight when error means dying of food poisoning in a cave during a blizzard. The discoveries accumulated. Deep snow burial kept meat fresh for weeks. Certain depths worked better than others. Some wrapping methods succeeded where others failed. She learned these lessons through methods that would never pass a modern ethics review, testing preserved meat on herself before feeding it to others, waiting to see if her stomach would rebel. It did not. Winter, it seemed, could be tricked into preserving life instead of ending it. When the hunters returned empty-handed, their faces carrying that particular gauntness that indicated they had not merely failed but failed spectacularly, Usher made what must have seemed an insane announcement. She served them meat from a kill made 20 days earlier. The clan elder, who happened to be her own mother because Ice Age political structures were delightfully uncomplicated, declared it evil magic and forbade the practice. This was not an unreasonable position. Eating weeks-old meat violated everything their ancestors had learned about survival. Then again, their ancestors had died quite regularly during winter, so perhaps their knowledge had certain limitations. When starvation moved from threat to certainty, Usher defied the taboo with the confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. She led the women because the men were occupied with the traditional masculine activities of hunting and failing to find anything in excavating a deeper cave where ice never melted. It was, without anyone quite realizing it, humanity's first deliberate cold storage facility. The knowledge spread through the sort of whispered conversations that occur between sisters when they are trying not to die, mothers teaching daughters in secret because tradition matters right up until it conflicts with survival. The results were, by Ice Age standards, remarkable. The clan that should have been busy dying that winter instead emerged in spring stronger than their neighbors. Their children laughed, which was notable primarily because children in neighboring clans were lying still in shallow graves. One hesitates to call this a competitive advantage, but one would be lying if one did not. 3 generations, a mere eye blink in evolutionary time, though presumably quite tedious to live through, transformed Usha's desperate secret into something approaching sacred knowledge. Her great-granddaughter, Sela, inherited not merely the techniques but the entire social apparatus that had developed around them. The Ice Keepers, as they were now called, guarded the preservation caves and made decisions about who received stored meat during famines. This was, one might note, considerably more power than women typically wielded in hunter-gatherer societies. Control food, control life. The equation was simple and absolute. The caves themselves had evolved from simple holes into elaborate chambers with different temperature zones. Someone had worked out ventilation channels through the limestone. Hide-covered entrance chambers maintained consistent cold. Sela discovered that wrapping meat in certain aromatic plants, wild thyme and juniper, not only preserved but actually enhanced flavor. Humanity's first deliberately aged foods. One wonders if she realized she was inventing cuisine, or if she simply thought the meat tasted better and left philosophy to people with more spare time. The revolution that followed was immediate and, naturally, violent. Human nature does not change merely because circumstances do. 3 generations passed, which is to say that time continued its annoying habit of moving forward regardless of whether anyone asked it to. Usha's discovery had made the transition from desperate secret to sacred knowledge, which is the trajectory of most useful information once enough people survive because of it. Her great-granddaughter Sela inherited not merely the techniques anyone could learn to bury meat in snow, but the rather more complicated responsibility of deciding who lived and who died during famines. The Ice Keepers, as they were now called with the sort of capital letters one could hear in people's voices, guarded the preservation caves and wielded the kind of power that makes traditional chiefs rather nervous. The caves themselves had evolved in the way that anything evolves when people have strong incentives not to starve. Simple holes had become elaborate chambers with different temperature zones because someone had worked out that different meats required different conditions. Ventilation channels carved through limestone prevented the unfortunate buildup of gases that had killed several early experimenters, their deaths contributing valuably to humanity's understanding of airflow. Hide-covered entrance chambers maintained consistent cold through a series of overlapping flaps that would have impressed modern refrigerator engineers had such people existed, which they did not. Sela made her own contributions to the science because apparently innovation was heritable in her family. She discovered that wrapping meat in certain aromatic plants, wild thyme and juniper specifically, did more than preserve. It enhanced. The meat developed flavors that fresh-killed meat simply did not possess. One hesitates to suggest she invented the concept of cuisine, but one would not be entirely wrong. Her discoveries spread through the Ice Keepers network with the speed of information that keeps people alive, which is to say, rapidly. The power shift that followed was immediate and, in the grand tradition of human power shifts, violent. The Crow clan from the eastern valleys, having noticed with some irritation that Sela's people survived winters without the customary losses, decided that they would simply take the ice caves. This struck them as more efficient than developing their own preservation knowledge, which it would have been had they succeeded. They attempted a night raid, demonstrating the sort of tactical thinking that values surprise over sustainability. The battle that followed was notable, not for its spears and stones, those were standard enough, but for its strategic innovation. Sela's warriors, rather than defending the caves directly, destroyed the raiders' own meager food supplies. Then they waited. This was warfare as economic calculation rather than physical contest. Within 7 days, the Crow clan found themselves in the awkward position of being too weak to fight and too proud to beg, right up until hunger made the decision for them. They surrendered, offering their best hunters in marriage alliance for access to preservation knowledge. Pride, it turned out, was less important than eating. This new form of warfare, where controlling food meant controlling life, spread across the inhabited valleys with the enthusiasm of any good idea that makes traditional warfare look rather inefficient. Chiefs who had ruled through strength, the ability to throw spears accurately, wrestle effectively, and generally intimidate people found themselves overthrown by those who controlled the ice caves. It was humanity's first resource-based power structure, though nobody called it that because economic terminology would not be invented for another 30,000 years or so. The revolution reached its peak when Sela, now an elder and presumably tired of people trying to steal her caves, made a radical decision. She would trade preservation knowledge for exotic goods. This was either brilliant or insane, depending on one's perspective regarding trade secrets. Coastal peoples brought salt, which Sela's daughter discovered could preserve meat even in summer heat, solving a problem that had seemed fundamentally unsolvable. Mountain clans offered obsidian, which made knives that cut cleaner, reducing spoilage through simple mechanics. One thing led to another, as it tends to do. The trading gatherings became massive seasonal events. Thousands gathered, which would have been suicide in Asha's time, when feeding 100 people for more than a few days meant someone was going hungry. But with preserved food supplies, people could congregate without the immediate threat of starvation. This enabled the first non-survival cultural exchanges, which is a polite way of saying that humans finally had time to do things other than desperately seek calories. Songs about the Ice Mothers spread across the continent. Each culture added their own verses, creating an oral tradition that would survive millennia. The songs were about women who conquered winter, which was both accurate and the sort of thing that makes traditional masculine heroic narratives look rather limited. Men killed mammoths, which was impressive. Women made winter survivable, which was arguably more impressive, though suspects' arguments on this topic became heated around campfires. Art flourished on cave walls, because artists need to eat, and preserved food meant someone could feed them. Hunters who were no longer desperately seeking the next meal discovered they had time to mix pigments and dream. The great painted caves of the period show animals that are both anatomically accurate and spiritually significant, suggesting their creators had achieved that peculiar human ability to think about things other than immediate survival. The animals they painted were ones they had conquered through preservation rather than spears, though the spears still featured prominently because masculine ego is also heritable. The cultural flowering that followed was unprecedented because nothing like it had ever preceded it. Music became more complex, stories grew longer, rituals developed that served no survival purpose whatsoever, but made life feel meaningful, which is perhaps more important than survival in the long term. People began to specialize, some became exceptional toolmakers, others storytellers, still others focused on the spiritual dimensions of existence that had always been present, but which nobody had time to contemplate when they were busy starving. The ice keepers themselves became a formalized institution with ranks, responsibilities, and the sort of bureaucratic structure that makes historians weep with joy when they discover evidence of it. Young women trained for years under elder ice keepers, learning not just preservation techniques, but the politics of food distribution, the diplomacy of trading relationships, and the subtle art of maintaining power through controlling something everyone needed. It was humanity's first professional class, though one doubts they saw themselves in those terms. Marriage patterns shifted dramatically. Alliances were forged through marriages that combined preservation knowledge from different traditions. The children of these unions, raised with multiple preservation techniques, innovated hybrid methods that surpassed their parents' work. Cultural exchange through matrimony proved remarkably effective at spreading technology, though one suspects the participants were more interested in not starving than in advancing human knowledge. 500 generations after Asha had stumbled over frozen meat, a span of time that makes individual human lives seem rather insignificant. Preservation knowledge had become foundational, but foundations, as anyone who has built anything knows, are merely the beginning. 500 generations after Asha's discovery, approximately 20,000 years before Christ. For those keeping track, preservation knowledge had transformed from tribal secret to the foundation of complex societies. This is what happens when useful information survives long enough. It stops being revolutionary and starts being infrastructure. The Great Winter Gathering at Mammoth Crossing brought together 50 clans, nearly 3,000 people, all sustained by stored foods that would have been impossible in Usher's time. The gathering itself was proof of concept. 3,000 people congregating without anyone starving was, by historical standards, showing off. The preservation techniques had evolved into an intricate science, though nobody called it science because that word would not be invented for another 22,000 years. Smoking meat over specific woods imparted different flavors and preservation qualities. Salt curing in graduated concentrations allowed for fine control over preservation time and taste. Fermentation in sealed clay vessels created foods that were, technically speaking, partially decomposed but in a way that humans found delicious rather than fatal. The distinction mattered. Ice caves had been engineered with drainage systems and temperature controls that maintained perfect conditions year-round, suggesting someone had been paying attention to thermodynamics before thermodynamics had a name. The dark side of this revolution manifested with the inevitability of human nature encountering valuable resources. The Wolf Brotherhood, a confederation of northern tribes with an unfortunate name and worse intentions, attempted to monopolize all salt sources between the mountains and the sea. Their logic was impeccable. Control salt, control preservation, control who survives winter. Their methods were less admirable. They systematically destroyed rival preservation sites and executed captured ice keepers, which was both strategically sound and morally horrifying. The preservation wars had begun, though one suspects the participants called them something more dramatic. The systematic destruction of preservation knowledge was, even by the standards of prehistoric warfare, remarkably short-sighted. Killing ice keepers meant losing the very expertise the Wolf Brotherhood sought to monopolize. But strategic thinking has never been humanity's strongest quality when violence is available as an alternative. The conflict spanned 3 winters, which meant it lasted longer than most of the participants' lifespans given Ice Age mortality rates. This was total war before the concept existed, fought over food security rather than territory or honor. The alliance of the Southern Caves responded with innovation born of desperation, which is humanity's traditional response to existential threats. They developed portable preservation methods, hide packages of salt-dried meat that warriors could carry for weeks. This enabled long-distance raids that had been previously impossible, turning the Wolf Brotherhood's size advantage into a logistics problem. Large armies need large food supplies. Small raiding parties with portable preserved food could strike and disappear like particularly well-fed ghosts. The war culminated at the Battle of Frozen Lake, which had the sort of dramatic name that suggests someone survived to tell the complete story. The Alliance forces, outnumbered by margins that should have guaranteed their defeat, survived a month-long siege through careful rationing of their preserved supplies. The Wolf Brotherhood, confident in their numbers but careless with their food stores in the way that overconfident forces tend to be, slowly starved on the frozen plain. One imagines the irony was lost on them until quite late in the process. They had started a war over food preservation and lost because they failed to preserve their food. History does enjoy its symmetries. From this conflict emerged humanity's first diplomatic protocols, which is what happens when everyone realizes that the alternative is mutual starvation. The Great Preservation Treaty, marked by elaborate ceremonies where each tribe contributed preserved foods to a common store, established protected status for ice keepers. They became, effectively, neutral parties in all conflicts, which was both sensible and unprecedented. Safe passage for salt traders was guaranteed, creating the first protected trade routes. One could argue this was the beginning of international law, though one would be using terms that would not exist for millennia. Mixed tribe marriages became common, with dowries paid not in traditional wealth but in preservation, knowledge, and stored foods. This was either romantic or transactional depending on one's perspective, but it was certainly practical. Children from these unions, raised with multiple preservation traditions, innovated hybrid techniques that surpassed their parents' methods in the way that hybrid vigor works for ideas as well as genetics. Cultural exchange through matrimony proved remarkably effective at spreading technology, though the wedding ceremonies were probably less focused on love and more on not starving. The young woman Merai, born of a mountain mother and coastal father, discovered that alternating salt and cold preservation created foods that lasted entire years. This was a breakthrough that enabled her clan to establish humanity's first permanent year-round settlement beside a reliable ice cave. Permanent settlement, one might note, was not a goal anyone had been pursuing. It simply became possible once year-round food security was achievable. The settlement at what would later be called Merai's Cave grew to house over 200 people, which was approximately 190 more than traditional mobile hunting bands could support. The social implications were staggering. Permanent settlement meant accumulated possessions, which meant wealth inequality, which meant social hierarchy based on something other than hunting prowess. The old chiefs, men who ruled through strength and hunting skill, found themselves subordinate to those who controlled food stores. This was not a peaceful transition. Several attempted to reassert traditional authority through violence and discovered that well-fed defenders of food stores could outlast hungry attackers. The message was clear. In the new order, feeding people mattered more than killing animals. The permanent settlement also meant that the elderly, who would have been left behind during seasonal migrations, could contribute to society. They became the keepers of knowledge, teaching preservation techniques, telling stories, and generally being useful in ways that mobile societies could not accommodate. Childhood lasted longer because children did not need to become productive hunters and gatherers as quickly. Education, in its earliest form, became possible when survival was not quite so immediate a concern. By the time the great ice sheets began their final retreat, approximately 10,000 years before Christ, preservation knowledge had become so fundamental that origin stories of the time before were considered myth. Nobody believed there had ever been a time when humans did not preserve food, which is what happens when knowledge becomes universal. Asha's name, if it survived at all, existed only in songs whose meanings had been lost to time. By 10,000 years before Christ, as the great ice sheets began their final retreat with the geological equivalent of a shrug, preservation knowledge had become so fundamental that origin stories of the time before were considered myth. Nobody believed humans had once died regularly during winter, which is what happens when a problem is solved so thoroughly that people forget it ever existed. The descendants of Asha, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, spread from the Atlantic shores to the Siberian plains, each culture having developed unique preservation methods suited to their environment. This was convergent evolution applied to food technology, which sounds impressive until one realizes it simply meant that everyone independently discovered that not starving was preferable to starving. Desert peoples perfected sun-drying and salt preservation in the absence of ice, because ice caves are notably scarce in deserts. Arctic tribes built elaborate ice houses that maintained perfect preservation conditions, because they had ice in rather excessive quantities. The techniques varied wildly, but the principle remained constant: control decay, control survival. The accumulated knowledge passed through memorized songs stretching thousands of verses, each line encoding specific techniques discovered through millennia of experimentation. These songs were humanity's first databases, though they rhymed better than modern databases and required significantly less electricity. The true revolution came when preserved food enabled humanity's next great leap, which nobody saw coming because revolutions rarely announce themselves in advance. A young man named Crowcaller, freed from constant hunting by his clan's vast preserved stores, spent entire seasons observing wild grain. This was the sort of activity that would have been unthinkable in Asha's time, when spending seasons watching grass grow would have been called suicide rather than research. But Crowcaller had the luxury of curiosity, which is what happens when your stomach is full enough to let your brain do something other than obsess about calories. He noticed that seeds stored in the same cold caves as meat remained viable for planting years later. This observation led to experiments with deliberate planting near the preservation caves, conducted with the confidence of someone who knew his clan would not starve if the harvest failed. This distinction mattered enormously. Previous attempts at agriculture had been desperate gambles where failure meant death. Crowcaller's experiments were conducted with a safety net made of preserved food, allowing him to fail repeatedly until he succeeded. Within 10 generations, his descendants were storing not just preserved meat but grain surpluses, creating food security that supported populations in the thousands rather than dozens. The shift from preservation enabling survival to preservation enabling agriculture was subtle enough that nobody noticed they were living through a revolution. They simply noticed that storing grain was more efficient than storing meat, that planted grain grew more reliably than wild grain, and that larger populations could be supported through agriculture than through hunting. Each observation seemed minor. Collectively, they transformed human civilization in ways that would have horrified Usher had she been available for comment. Her desperate cave experiments had led, through a chain of causation spanning 35,000 years, to farming. One suspects she would have had opinions about this. The final transformation was psychological and spiritual, which is to say it involved the peculiarly human habit of making meaning out of survival. Humans who had once lived moment to moment, never knowing if tomorrow would bring feast or famine, now planned years ahead. This required a different sort of mind than the one evolution had originally provided. The ability to delay gratification, to store food for winters that had not yet arrived, to plan for children not yet born, these were cognitive abilities that preservation knowledge had made essential and which agriculture would make fundamental. Preserved food enabled labor specialization, which is what happens when not everyone needs to spend all their time acquiring calories. Toolmakers who contributed no food but created better tools. Artists who produced nothing edible but whose work made life feel meaningful. Storytellers who fed no one but who made human experience comprehensible. Shamans who provided no calories but who connected communities to something larger than survival. Each specialist represented calories spent on something other than survival, which would have been impossible in Usher's time, and which was now not merely possible but expected. The great painted caves, showing hunting scenes and spiritual visions, were created by artists fed on preserved foods. Their minds, free to imagine rather than merely survive, produced art that would survive millennia and inspire people who had forgotten why survival had once been so difficult. The animals they painted were rendered with anatomical precision and spiritual significance, suggesting their creators understood both the physical and metaphysical dimensions of existence. This was cognitive surplus made visible, preserved food transformed into culture. Marriage ceremonies incorporated the ritual exchange of preserved foods, symbolizing the couple's commitment to survive together through all winters. This was both practical and romantic, which is perhaps the best definition of functional matrimony. Death rituals included preserved foods for the journey to the afterlife, showing how deeply preservation had penetrated human consciousness. The dead were sent off with supplies for a journey nobody had returned from, to confirm the necessity of packing. But it felt right, which is what the ritual is for. The spiritual dimension of preservation knowledge evolved into elaborate mythology. Ice mothers became goddesses. Preservation caves became sacred sites. The techniques themselves became religious secrets, taught through initiation rituals that combined practical instruction with spiritual significance. This was not ignorance replacing knowledge, but rather knowledge becoming so important that it needed spiritual weight to ensure its transmission. Modern people might call this superstition. Ice Age people called it ensuring their children did not forget how to survive. In the end, Usher's desperate discovery in a frozen cave became nothing less than the foundation of civilization itself, the invisible revolution that made all other human achievements possible. Agriculture required preservation knowledge to provide the safety net for experimentation. Permanent settlements required year-round food security. Art required surplus calories. Religion required time to contemplate existence. Writing would eventually be invented primarily to track grain stores. Cities would rise where food could be preserved and distributed. Empires would fall when their preservation systems failed. None of this was inevitable. Usher could have ignored the frozen meat. The clan elder could have successfully forbidden its use. The knowledge could have died with a single unlucky winter. But it did not. A desperate woman in a cave 35,000 years before Christ discovered that cold preserves food, and everything that followed agriculture, civilization, the entire human story became possible. History does not often provide such clear moments of transformation, which is why this one deserves remembering, even if Asha's name has long since turned to dust.